So what we've got here, once a year, the Australian Tax Office puts out its transparency report. And it's the one time where we can go and see where the biggest companies in the world, how much tax they pay in Australia. And just to give you the all-stars report in a very brief way, News, zero tax again. Lend-Lease, zero tax again. Chevron, another US oil giant, zero tax again, billions of dollars in income. Who else have we got? Vodafone, zero tax again, 6 years in a row. We have some rising stars though. The boys from Atlassian finally got on the scoreboard and managed to pay some tax. Many years after becoming billionaires, they paid $11 million on their $1.5 billion in Australia. That's only Australia, mind you. They make a bit of money overseas, obviously. Well done to them. Qantas, amazingly paying tax. Now, these numbers are a little bit old. They lag by a couple of years because Qantas will not be paying any tax for a long time now because of COVID, as with many of the other companies on this list. Roughly a third of Australia's 2,500 biggest companies don't pay any tax. Some of that is bona fide. A lot of it is serious tax dodging, tricky tax avoidance with the help of the big four, tax advisors, auditors and consultants. Again, some of the highlights, the FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix and Google, they are starting to pay some tax, still playing a lot of tricks, still offshoring a lot of income. Oil and gas, absolutely appalling again. The great irony about oil and gas is that you have these massive foreign giant oil and gas producers paying zero tax in Australia year after year, even though they're extracting their oil and gas from our seabeds and onshore properties. They're fracking for it in Queensland, etc. Despite this, no tax. The latest is that the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, has actually just come out with a plan to give them some taxpayer money to help subsidise their refineries because they're complaining that they want to close down the refineries. So that's what's happening. We're giving these foreigners subsidies because they're complaining that it's too hard. After not paying tax, some of them for decades. Let's look at a couple of the others. Electricity. These guys in the electricity sector, they've always been highly sus. Not all of them. AGL pays a bit of tax. It's a big polluter, pays its tax though. Ausgrid. Two privatised Ausgrid entities. Here they are, 476 million, 660 million in income, zero tax from Ausgrid. Nice work by the New South Wales government privatising Ausgrid because they've absconded and they're not paying a cent in tax. That's it, it's gone. You've privatised it, the bankers have made a lot of fees, the new shareholders probably making money out of it somewhere in the world. Energy Australia Holdings, the giant. Despite its Energy Australia moniker, its parent company is in the British Virgin Islands, the notorious tax haven. It's such a good tax haven that Sir Richard Branson even has his own island in the British Virgin Islands. Energy Australia has heroically begun to pay some tax. They actually paid an incredible amount of tax this year after being hammered by us for the past 4 or 5 years. 7.4 billion was their total income, and these are formerly private. These are assets which used to belong to the state. They've been privatised, and now they're bundled up into Energy Australia, which is owned in the BVI, the British Virgin Islands, and the Caribbean. 7.4 billion, and they paid this time 240 million in tax. For years they paid zero. They just funneled it out to a Caribbean tax haven. So good work, Energy Australia, coming good. Victoria Power Networks, though, which is controlled by Chinese interests, zero yet again. So if you're in Victoria and you're paying your electricity bills, you can be happy in the knowledge that that money is probably going off to China tax-free. Well done. Viva Energy, which took over Shell in Australia, the Shell downstream assets, which is the service stations when you go and fill your car up with gas, 5.8 billion they made just last year, billions of this sort of stuff every year, zero tax payable. Gas, Origin, they're starting to pay a bit more tax, although they have been a notorious tax bludger in the past. But what about ConocoPhillips, this foreign giant? 1.6 billion revenue, zero tax payable. CNOOC. CNOOC is the Chinese state-owned enterprise, and it is a participant in a LNG exporting operation out of Gladstone. Zero tax. Well done. Slow clapped for the Chinese. Well done there. No doubt they've got their lobbyists working overtime in Canberra to pull off these sorts of feats. We have our Lobbyland t-shirt on today, just showing off the latest in the fashion range in support of a federal ICAC, of course, before the whole place goes to rack and ruin. Woodside, zero on 8.2 billion in revenue. They would spend more on their political donations to both the major parties than they would paying tax. Or at least they used to be a better taxpayer, now they're hopeless. APLNG, Australia Pacific LNG, zero on 7.2 billion. So the gas are really, really bad. This mob, which is controlled by Shell, called QGC Upstream Holdings Proprietary Limited, 4 billion from fracking in Queensland, from tearing up the farmland in Queensland, polluting the rivers. Zero tax, not 1 red cent in tax. Santos, 4 billion, zero tax. Seahell, Shell Upstream, where they drill it out of the seabeds over in the northwest shelf. 5.5 billion for Shell Upstream, Seahell, zero tax. Australian Gas Networks, 3 companies within the CK group. Again, China controlled, 1 million payable on $617 million. That's not bad. Wish we had at Michael West Media a lovely tax rate like that. Beach Energy was good to give them their due, 192 million in tax, so that's a good small company coming good. Caltex and BP also paid plenty of tax, so good on them. Chevron, of course, another donut on their 12 billion of total income from extracting Australia's natural resources. Ichthys, zero. Puma Energy, a massive distributor of oil and gas, zero. Let's get to some of these other electricity. Spark Infrastructure, another thing controlled by China and Singapore, zero. Some of the weapons manufacturers who get solely Australian public money funding them in Australia, and as we know, the spending on weapons has been the fastest growing item of government expenditure. A lot of them paying very little, some paying a little bit. Glencore is a big success story, once regarded as maybe the nastiest corporation on the earth, the most aggressive mining and commodities trader, Glencore, based in Zug in Switzerland, operating out of London, with huge operations in Australia. Just one of their companies here, Glencore Investment Proprietary Limited, 20.7 billion in revenue. Now, last year, they finally bounced into the game and paid tax after we'd been hammering them for years for not paying tax. $1,000 they paid. Funnily enough, that took them off our top 40 tax dodgers list because the methodology is struck on various things, which they managed to game that. So they went from Australia's top 40, the number one on the charts, on the tax dodging charts, to disappear off the list totally. But this year, to give them credit, and there must be something going on with the ATO, which we don't know about here, because they've suddenly paid $813 million in tax. They probably owe Australia $20 billion in tax, but at least they're paying substantial amounts now. Let's have a look at some of the others. Some of the miners, we've got to say, were very good. Rio and BHP both paid about $4.2 billion each. They are the biggest taxpayers in the country this year, bigger than the banks. Of course, there's a huge iron ore boom going on, which helps. Andrew Forrest's Fortescue Metals, an absolutely huge payer as well. Gina Rinehart, also a very large payer of tax. Both Gina and Andrew Forrest basically cover the ABC's annual budget just with their corporate interests alone and individually. Some of the other suspects, here's an interesting one. Ikea. Ikea has a very tricky European tax avoidance structure with trusts and partnerships and various arrangements between different countries. They started paying a little bit of tax in Australia, nothing compared to their revenues, but they did get, because it's such a happy sort of branding exercise, Ikea, they felt they needed to pay a little bit of tax so they could avoid being on the likes of the top 40 every year. So they started paying tax, but they're back to their bad old ways. Here they are, and the latest bunch of ATO transparency data, 1.4 billion in revenue in Australia. They managed to wipe all their taxable income out, no doubt by bulking up their costs and IP payments out to Holland or Luxembourg or wherever they go, so that sort of area. Zero tax payable by Ikea in Australia during this year. This is the 2018-19 financial year. Just compare that for one moment to Nick Scali, which also makes and sells furniture. Nick Scali is an Australian company. Nick Scali, revenues of 266 million. They didn't wipe out all their taxable income like Ikea did. 59 million they managed to declare, and they paid $17.7 million in tax. You would have to call that a responsible, a reputable effort, a credible effort by Nick Scali. Ikea, you are a bunch of Swedish tax cheats. Let's get down to, Lend-Lease, one of our favourites. Lend-Lease, year in, year out, year after year, Lend-Lease manage to pay no tax. It looks like they are paying tax because when you look at their financial statements, there's a little bit saying, in the cash flow statement, look, we paid a bit of tax, but guess what? It's not turning up in these ATO numbers, which means that Lend-Lease is paying tax in another country, but not in its homeland of Australia. Lend-Lease, $10.4 billion in revenue in this year recorded. That in the latest batch of data, they managed to wipe almost all of that out and get it down to $14 million of taxable income and paid zero tax yet again. I think they're on the 10-year mark at least for paying zero tax now. Yet they still pay their bankers' interest on the loans. They still pay dividends to their shareholders. I bet they still pay political donations too. And they get government contracts, very large, luscious government contracts. So, they deserve a good hard walloping, and we're going to give it to them when we write this story up. A couple of others. Here we go, lovely. PricewaterhouseCoopers. PricewaterhouseCoopers. These guys advise all these multinationals on how to avoid tax. They also audit, with the other big three, or the rest of the big four, they audit all the world's biggest multinationals. The one bit of their empire in Australia that they did have to lodge some sort of public disclosure with is with the ATO, because they have a company here, not just a partnership, and it's called Pricewaterhouse ASEANZ, ASEANZ Consulting Proprietary Limited. So this is presumably the company which gets money from the government for paper shuffling, for giving advice to the government on how to conduct its business. 771 million this PwC company made. 771 million. Just this one bit, this government consulting part of PwC. Guess how much tax it paid? Zero. PwC, you are amongst the royalty of tax cheats globally. Always vying with your rivals, EY, Ernst & Young, KPMG, Deloitte, the big four. The royalty. Not only do they minimise their own tax to nothing, they tell everybody else all around the world how, if you can pay them enough money, how to cheat every other government. Doesn't matter if you're Africa or some poor place, and they could be if there was a PwC Mongolia, they'd be telling them how to rip off the Mongolian government. It doesn't matter, because this is business, and business is tough. Business is competitive. And if PwC doesn't rip them off, then EY will too. Burns Philp again, no tax in Australia. Dick Pratt, the old Dick Pratt, now Anthony Pratt, the cardboard box king. 2.75 billion. Oh, paid $9.4 million in tax. Wow, congratulations, Anthony. You have paid some income tax via Pratt Consolidated. Nice work. Pat on the shoulder. Who else have we got? We haven't even looked, but we can assume that Booking.com, the number one short stay player in the market, has again paid nothing. eBay, probably extremely very little as well. Interesting to see what's going on in the media section, because Fairfax, which is carving itself up, is now down to paying 1 million tax. Used to be a good taxpayer on 450 million in revenue, while Facebook is now surpassed Fairfax revenue in Australia, 581 million, and it's also paying a bit of tax, 15 million. Google's starting to pay a bit of tax too, 51 million in this year. Now, given the size of these things, Facebook and Google, given their strangleholds, their monopolistic positions, their very low cost base, because it's all just IP and computers, a few people, these guys are still paying very, very little, given they've decimated a lot of other industries. Not their fault, it's good on them, but they're not pulling their weight. The tax office has done quite a good job getting the money in from these guys. The FANGs, Amazon too, starting to pay a little tiny bit. But the fact is they're still using all sorts of tricks, like booking part of their revenue overseas, straight to Singapore, straight to Europe. So that is going to be a never-ending battle. That is going to keep happening. Till these things are properly, are either broken up, they're going to get too big, they will be in a battle with every tax authority in the world. It's lovely to see the national carrier, Qantas. Alan Joyce, congratulations. Your company has finally paid more tax than it pays to you in executive remuneration. That is a huge effort. Now, we know you're not going to earn $35 million this year, unfortunately, and we are sorry about that, but we will commend you. $17.5 billion in revenue, $259 million. They finally paid a reasonable whack of tax after many years. They paid $10 million last year, but then dot for many years before that. Now, Qantas is a tough business, and they do make massive losses. Just an observation about these kind of things, and Virgin too, because Virgin has probably never paid tax in Australia. These companies do have bona fide losses, and they should not pay tax in a year, obviously, when they're making huge losses. When the price of jet fuel goes through the roof, or there's a volcano explosion in Iceland which closes the aviation down, they're subject to all kinds of threats. The problem, of course, is that what this illustrates, in other countries, you cannot infinitely keep claiming tax losses. Qantas will keep on, now that COVID has come, these numbers are pre-COVID, this will go on. This will go on. They will not pay tax for years, many more years now. The politicians must, and the bureaucrats must, look at capping tax losses like they do in the US and in other countries, to say you cannot keep on soaking up your losses and dragging them out forever and not paying tax. You must pay tax in the good years. Of course, the other little thing here which is taken for granted is the fact that the trusts, so the entire property sector, things like Sydney Airport, Stockland and Mirvac, they don't pay any tax. Transurban, like a tax collector on the toll roads, and there's monopolies all over the place. More monopolies than anybody, Transurban. No tax again. Sydney Airport, no tax again, because they won't be paying any tax in the coming year either because of the COVID situation, which smashed both of them hard. Stockland and Mirvac, huge billion-dollar property developers, nothing. These are trusts. These are tricky staple trust securities, and what happens here is the trust holders, the unit holders, it's incumbent upon them to pay the tax. So the trusts don't pay the tax. I think it's time now to make these things pay tax like everybody else. Transurban and Sydney Airport, if they've got overseas holders, do they pay tax? Do the super funds really pay at 15%, which is half of the 30% corporate tax rate anyway? There's a lot of leakage going on in the property sector. Transurban, 2.5 billion, zero tax. We might just say it's worth looking at some of the best taxpayers. Can you guess what the very best is? The very biggest taxpayer in Australia. Over a 6-year period, it was BHP and Rio in this outing. Iron ore prices going through the roof, 4 billion each, 8 billion between them. The biggest taxpayer over the 6 years of available tax office data is the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, for all its sins, for all its foibles, for all its selling products to dead people and 56,000 breaches of the Money Laundering Act. $20.8 billion tax payable over the 6 years. 20 billion, just this one company, this one bank. Now, because of the franking credits regime, which the reverse Robin Hood, which takes money from ordinary Joe Public and puts it into the hands of mostly wealthy retirees, that 20.79 billion won't all make it to the tax office. But a lot of it will, and good on them. It's a huge number. BHP came in second at 18 billion. Westpac Banking Corporation, it might have just been busted by Austrac for basically being the pedophiles' bank of choice. And what was it? It wasn't 56,000 breaches, it was hundreds of thousands of breaches, I think, of the... it's good work, hundreds of thousands of breaches of the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws. But to its credit, Westpac Banking Corporation, 17.75 billion over 6 years. The next one was Rio Tinto, then another bank, National Australia Bank, with 13.6 billion. ANZ, 12 billion, then it drops down to Telstra, Wesfarmers, Andrew Forrest Fortescue Metals, AMP, 4 billion. Gina's down there, Hancock Prospecting, 2 billion odd. Sometimes it's the people that you don't really expect, isn't it, that pay all the tax, that really pull their weight. But the thing I take out of this is that no one institution, just like no one person, is all good or all bad. They have their strengths and their weaknesses in different ways. Some people are terrible tax cheats, but have quite a good corporate culture and a good for stakeholders in some ways. And some people are fine corporate citizens like PwC, EY, KPMG, Deloitte, but are terrible tax cheats and facilitators globally of tax avoidance. So that's another year. The government has put out a press release via the ATO saying that the tax gap has been closed to $2 billion. That is the corporate tax gap, $2 billion. That's what they reckon is just left. It's over. We've conquered corporate tax avoidance, they say. They've come up with a metric called the tax gap. We think it should probably be called the credibility gap. If Exxon can do $13 billion in income taking gas, selling it overseas, and not pay any tax for yet another year. That, I reckon, Exxon covers that $2 billion. There's 2,500 companies which the government is claiming, is asserting, are responsible for pretty perfect corporate behaviour. Just $2 billion between them. That's all they owe. $2 billion between them. The tax gap. Well, we think that's absolute nonsense. But of course the media has got the press releases from the government. They dropped it last week in the afternoon, in the early evening. They published it all, and then the next day at 3 o'clock, the actual real numbers have come out. So we can see who's made their $10 billion and paid no tax. Or in the case of the banks, made their billions and paid tax. The point being that the tax gap is a PR mechanism designed to make the case that the government has done such a fine job battling corporate tax avoidance that it's basically finished. There is no more. Well, as we can see from Ikea, paying zero in Australia, as we can see from Exxon and all the oil majors, that is not the case. This is a battle which will not end. It will go on. And while the government focuses on welfare bludgers, robo-debts and all this sort of thing, trying to get money out of small people, demonising small people, tradies, bludging. We're not saying tradies are perfect tax citizens. We all know what tradies are like. But who are the biggest tax cheats? The biggest tax cheats are the corporations. You have the good and the bad, the ones that contribute a lot of money via their profits to fund hospitals and schools, roads, infrastructure, defence, the protection of the citizenry. And then you've got other ones that pay nothing year after year until they get like Energy Australia with their little Caribbean tax havens, until they get shamed into it, or Glencore. And now there's still these people like ExxonMobil, like Chevron, like Ikea, like Lend-Lease, paying nothing. Looking after their shareholders, well, that's fine, but giving nothing back to the country in which they operate. Thanks for watching.